In the spring of 1874, the Pinkertons sent three of their best down to Missouri, hoping to put a stop to Jesse James. One of the detectives, Joseph Witcher, arrived in the town of Liberty on March 10th, stopping at a hotel where he made the mistake of registering under his real name. He then paid a visit to Clay County Sheriff George E. Patton, explaining his intentions to go undercover as a traveling laborer, and hopefully, fingers crossed, infiltrate the James farm. Next, Witcher stopped at a bank, depositing $50, while at the same time informing the bank's president of his plans. As I'm sure you can imagine, the banker was appalled by Witcher's lack of discretion. After all, the James boys were proven killers. They were extremely wary of outsiders, and here was this Witcher guy boldly announcing his plans, seemingly to all who would listen. That being the case, he was quickly taken to a back room and told to stay put, while the banker fetched the former sheriff, O.P. Moss. And Moss was likewise astounded. Tried his best to talk Witcher out of it, saying that if Jesse and Frank didn't kill him, then the old woman would. The old woman, of course, being Jesse's mother, Zerelda. Nevertheless, Detective Witcher had a job to do. He soon caught a train to nearby Kearney, sent one last telegraph to his boss, and set off down the road on foot, bound for the James farm. And when his body was discovered the following day, it had 3 new bullet holes in it courtesy of rebel revolvers. Legend has it that a note was stuck to Witcher's corpse that read, "This to all detectives." Just a few days later, 2 more Pinkertons caught up with Jesse James' allies, John and Jim Younger. And when the smoke cleared, there was one less Pinkerton in the land of the living. Naturally, the agency's founder, Alan Pinkerton, vowed revenge. Quote, "I know that the James and the Youngers are desperate men, and that when we meet, it must be the death of one or both of us. My blood was spilt, and they must repay. There is no use talking. They must die." Join me today as we discuss the war between the Pinkertons and Jesse James, a bloody feud that would culminate in an ill-advised attack on the James farm, and the tragic death of Jesse's 8-year-old brother. We'll also be talking about that quote-unquote special device that was thrown through the window. You know the one. Was it really a bomb or something else entirely? What in the hell is Greek fire anyway? Why do I have a Band-Aid on my forehead? And just how far would Jesse James go to exact revenge? My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Hey, just real quick, if you're watching on YouTube, please ignore the Disney-themed Band-Aid. Just a few minutes ago, I got in a hurry and literally opened a door on my head. Pretty sure I need stitches, but I'm going to worry about that later. For now, the show must go on. Also, I've heard from many of you that I'm not blinking enough, so I don't know, I guess I'll try to blink a little more. All right, so what exactly did Jesse James do that caused the Pinkertons to declare war? Believe it or not, their beef began even before those detectives were killed. For example, on July 21st, 1873, Jesse and his compadres held up a train just outside of Adair, Iowa. And just to ensure that everything went as planned, they arrived early and pried loose several of the rail spikes. Once done, the bandits strung a rope through the loose rails and simply waited. At 8:30 that night, here comes the train right on schedule, slowing down as it approached a curve in the tracks. That's when the outlaws yanked on that rope. The engineer hit the brakes and tried to go in reverse, but by that point, it just weren't no use. 3 of the cars ended up flipping off the tracks entirely, killing said engineer and injuring several of the passengers. As for Jesse James, he quickly worked his way to the express car and pointed a pistol straight at the express messenger's head, telling him that if he didn't hand over the key to the safe, he'd blow his damn brains out. The messenger wisely did as he was told. The only problem was the safe didn't contain near as much money as Jesse was hoping. Meanwhile, 2 of his buddies were likewise robbing the passengers, while at the same time proclaiming, "We are not petty thieves, we are bold robbers. We're robbing the rich for the poor. We're Grangers." End of quote. The entire ordeal would take no longer than 10 minutes, and when the outlaws rode away, they were a little over $2,000 richer. Certainly not the most lucrative heist of all time, but for what it's worth, they had just robbed their very first train. What many to this day consider to be the first train robbery to occur in the West. Now, we will get back to the Pinkertons here in just a moment, I promise, but there are a few things regarding this most recent holdup that I think are worth discussing. Just a moment ago, I mentioned how the outlaws claimed to be Grangers. If you're not familiar, the Grangers were essentially an advocacy group that lobbied on behalf of farmers. And in the early 1870s, the Grangers were not happy with the railroads. Matter of fact, a lot of people especially in Jesse's home state of Missouri, were not happy with the railroads. Not only were they an example of extravagant wealth in a time of struggle, but they earned that wealth partly off the backs of poor farmers. And in response, the Grangers were just trying to get the farmers easier and cheaper access to the markets, in addition to less restrictions on commerce. But were the James boys actual members of the Grangers? No, as far as I'm aware, they were not. But they were very concerned with their public image. Or I guess I should say Jesse was very concerned. Remember, for the past few years, that newspaper buddy of his, John Newman Edwards, had been singing Jesse's praises, and in doing so, creating the myth that he and the gang were Robin Hood types, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, i.e. the farmers, despite there being very little in the way of evidence of them ever sharing their spoils with anyone but themselves. Consequently, by 1873, it does appear as if Jesse was starting to believe his own hype. Make no mistake about it, his main motivations were monetary, but he was still very careful to cultivate his public image, and pretty much everything he was doing at this point had political undertones. For instance, in addition to shouting out the Grangers, Jesse and his pals also wore hoods of the sort used by the Ku Klux Klan, or at least they did during that train robbery in Iowa. This, much like their nod to the Grangers, was done intentionally. And no, I also do not think that Jesse was a member of the Klan. It was basically just a big PR stunt. By claiming to be Grangers, they could garner some goodwill amongst the populace, many of whom were themselves farmers. And according to historian T.J. Stiles, they wore those hoods to make a public declaration about the South's continued defiance, especially considering that several highly publicized Klan cases were underway at that very moment. Not to mention President Grant recently signing legislation specifically targeting the Klan, something that Jesse's buddy and political mentor, John Edwards, considered tyrannical. Now, in the weeks following that train robbery, the gang sought refuge near the town of Dover, Missouri. But by September, Jesse and Frank were back home in Clay County, where they remained at least somewhat protected. It was during this same period that Governor Silas Woodson placed a $1,000 bounty on Jesse's head. But be that as it may, I suppose a man's got to eat, right? Bounty or no bounty. And that tiny haul from that train in Iowa wasn't going to last forever. So it were that in early January of 1874, Jesse and the gang struck yet again, this time robbing a stage down in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. This was followed by another stage holdup just a few days later outside of Hot Springs, Arkansas. They asked if any of the passengers had fought for the Confederacy, and when one of them raised his hand, his valuables were returned. By contrast, another passenger, who just so happened to have a Yankee accent, got a shotgun aimed at his noggin. But thankfully, that's as far as it went. Now, riding with Jesse and Frank on this particular adventure was Cole Younger, along with one of Cole's brothers, possibly John, and another bandit by the name of Arthur McCoy, a.k.a. the Mad Irishman. I don't know a lot about McCoy, but he was a bit older than the others. Originally from Ireland, he had allegedly spent time in California during the gold rush before settling down in St. Louis. It was there where he helped form a secessionist group, and later on during the war, he supposedly rode with William Quantrell and the Bushwhackers. I say supposedly because I did have a very hard time locating information on Mr. McCoy. Hell, even his fate is shrouded in mystery. There are some who claim that he died in Texas in the early 1880s, and others who think that he met his demise not long after that robbery at Hot Springs. Whatever the case, I do think it's likely that McCoy remained with Jesse and Cole as they continued their journey north. The bandits crossed back into Missouri on January 27th, and then just a few days later, they robbed the Iron Mountain Express over at Gadd's Hill. Now, Gadd's Hill was just a tiny little fart of a town in southeastern Missouri. There was a general store, an old abandoned sawmill, and a platform for the railroad, and that was it. The bandits hit up the store first, stealing around $800 before gathering up the town's scant populace and forcing them to stand on the platform. And when the train finally came rumbling down the line, one of the outlaws began waving a red flag. The conductor hit the brakes, thinking there was some sort of an emergency, and no sooner had he stepped off the train than he was greeted with a pistol pointed directly at his face. From there, it was just a simple matter of disarming the express messenger and once again robbing the passengers. When one of them claimed to be a minister, the outlaws gave him his money back and asked that he say a prayer for him. Finally, they took an additional $50 off the conductor, along with his gold watch, and bid the town adieu. And just to reinforce what I said earlier about PR stunts, Jesse left behind his own press release there on the train, with special instructions that it be telegraphed to the St. Louis Dispatch, the same newspaper where his buddy, John Edwards, was currently working. The release, as written by Jesse, described the holdup as the most daring robbery on record. I don't know about all that, but they did manage to make off with around $2,000. Once again, not the biggest of scores, but hey, I guess it beats working a plow, right? Meanwhile, John Edwards dutifully published Jesse's statement. He also defended the robbery by saying that it and similar crimes were just a natural extension of the policies enacted by their political opponents. Remember, nothing that Jesse James ever did was his own fault. It was always in retaliation for a myriad of offenses committed by the Yankees, both real and imagined. Or so he and Edwards would have us believe. By the way, just real quick, I do want to clarify what an express messenger was and why Jesse and other outlaws were always robbing them. Let's say a bank in Kansas was shipping money to an even larger bank in, Chicago. The railroads themselves did not handle these shipments. Instead, they contracted with express companies like Wells Fargo, American Express, or in the case of the Gads Hill robbery, the Adams Express Company. The express messengers were just employees of the express companies, and it was the messenger's job to guard these shipments as they were being transported via the rails, almost in the same way that armored trucks move money around nowadays. And yeah, following that robbery at Gads Hill, it was the Adams Express Company, not the railroad, who called in the Pinkertons. As a result, Alan Pinkerton sent a few of his operatives down to Missouri, one of whom was the aforementioned Joseph Witcher. And well, we already discussed how he met his untimely demise. The only thing is, we don't know for certain who was responsible. If you recall, Witcher left the town of Kearney on March 10th. The next and final time he was seen alive, at least by non-criminals, was early on the morning of the 11th. It was still dark when 3 masked men arrived at a ferry on the Missouri River, claiming to be deputies. They had Witcher laid over a saddle, bound and gagged, and told the ferry operator that he was a horse thief. Then, of course, once they got him across the river, they shot him dead. Per at least one account, he was also tortured, but I wasn't able to verify that. Like I said, we don't know for sure who those 3 men were, but historians do think that at least one of them was Jesse James. According to some accounts, he was joined by Jim Anderson, brother of the late Bloody Bill Anderson, along with the Mad Irishman Arthur McCoy. Others think it was Frank and Clell Miller who accompanied Jesse. Whatever the case, Witcher was dead, and his Pinkerton colleagues wouldn't fare much better. By the way, the day after Witcher's murder, Jesse and Frank rode into Kearney and threatened the residents, telling them to keep their mouths shut. Very similar to what they had done back in 1869 after the close call with Deputy Thomason. As you'll soon learn, not everybody there in Clay County were fans of the James boys. Many were, but there was a small minority quietly working against them. And it was these same people that Jesse and Frank were looking to frighten. Now, like I said earlier, there were 2 additional Pinkertons there in Missouri at the time of Witcher's death, Detectives Lewis Lull and John Boyle. And joining them in the field was a former sheriff's deputy, a local guy by the name of Edwin Daniels. Just a few days after Witcher's death, the trio stopped at a farm just outside of Monegaw Springs, asking for directions. And unbeknownst to them, there at the farm eating dinner were none other than Jim and John Younger, little brothers of the infamous Cole Younger. And, well, I guess they didn't much like the looks of these strangers, so they quickly finished their meal and gave chase. The gunfight that ensued saw John Younger and the former deputy Daniels shot dead. Detective Lull was mortally wounded, and he'd ended up succumbing to his wounds just a couple of days later. The only survivors were Jim Younger and Detective Boyle. Jim had took off as soon as he realized that his brother was killed, and Boyle had been riding in the lead and thus was able to escape before the shooting even commenced. And yeah, Alan Pinkerton was not a happy camper. Not only were 2 of his men killed in a very short span of time, but Jesse James was still just as free as ever. And unfortunately, Pinkerton would end up stooping just as low, if not lower, than the outlaws. And in doing so, he'd caused the death of an 8-year-old boy. We'll get to that here very shortly, but in the meantime, Jesse decided to get hitched. On April 24th, 1874, just a little over a month after John Younger's death, James was wed in holy matrimony to his first cousin, Z. Mims, who, if you'll recall, was named after Jesse's own mother. Their uncle, feels weird saying their uncle, but hey, I guess it is what it is. Their uncle, William James, officiated the wedding at Z's sister's place over in Kearney. At one point, there was a brief scare as strangers were spotted approaching the house, but it turned out to be a false alarm. And following the ceremony, the newlyweds made a beeline to Sherman, Texas for their honeymoon. Sherman, of course, is where Jesse and the Bushwhackers would winter during the Civil War. At the time of his wedding, it was also where his sister Susie was living and teaching school. And while Jesse was down there in Texas, he may have possibly held up a stagecoach. As far as I'm aware, this is totally apocryphal, but a stage was indeed robbed just outside of Austin in late April or early May of 1874. I don't believe anybody was ever arrested, but there are many who think that maybe Jesse and a few of his pals were responsible. Older brother Frank would also tie the knot later on that summer, and by late August of 1874, they were right back in Missouri, robbing yet another stagecoach. Apparently, they had gotten wind of a guy named Parson Jennings, who traveled all the way to St. Louis to sell a passel of hogs for a whopping $5,000, or a little over $130,000 in today's money. Rumor had it that Jennings would travel through Lexington on his way back home, and if all went as planned, the James boys would be there waiting to relieve him of all that hard-earned money. Sure enough, on August 30th, Jesse, Frank, and one of the younger boys, not sure which, were lying in wait. Imagine their frustration when they stopped the stage and realized that Jennings was not on board, and neither was his rumored $5,000. Turns out he had came home a day earlier than expected. They still went ahead and robbed the other passengers, though. I guess sometimes when life gives you a wagon full of lemons, you just got to make some good old-fashioned Missouri lemonade, right? Now, believe it or not, one of the passengers, a woman named Maddie Hamlet, actually recognized him. She had known Jesse and Frank during the war and called out to him by name, saying that she was surprised they were pulling such a small job. To which Jesse replied, "Well, I'm a little ashamed of it myself. It's the first time we've ever stooped to such small game, but you needn't call names quite so loud." As they continued relieving the passengers of their valuables, Miss Hamlet began to protest. She demanded that Jesse return the driver's gold watch, which he did. And when Jesse tried to take the coat off of another passenger, she spoke up yet again. But this time, Jesse just ignored her. And when they were done, he addressed the crowd. Quote, "There is no point in chasing us. We're riding the finest horses in Missouri and will be 75 miles away by morning." He then turned his attention to Hamlet and stated, "Goodbye, Miss Maddie. You will never see us again." Now, an interesting aspect of this robbery was that it took place on a bluff in plain view of Lexington, which at that time had a population of around 4,000. And before it was all said and done, at least 100 people had gathered to witness the holdup. Just goes to show how bold Jesse had become. It also proved to be a major embarrassment for Governor Woodson, especially considering he was up for re-election. He and his team ended up reaching out to the St. Louis Police Department, requesting help. And in turn, St. Louis sent a scout by the super cool name of Florney Yancey to track the bandits down. Story has it that Yancey caught up to Jesse and Jim Younger just a few days later, not far from Excelsior Springs, at which point the hunter became the hunted. According to Yancey, he was approaching a dip in the road when Jesse and Jim sprung an ambush. That said, it does appear as if the former scout was more than able to hold his own. He ended up pulling his revolver quick as lightning and returning fire, allegedly blowing Jesse straight out of the saddle. I guess the gunfire also served to spook Yancey's horse, and it took off down the trail, him with it, likely saving his life in the process. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Going online without ExpressVPN is like not closing the door when you use the bathroom, okay? Even if you think you have nothing to hide, why give random creeps a chance to invade your privacy? So it works like this. Your internet traffic flows through the servers, which are owned by your internet service provider. And you better believe they know every single website that you visit. Not only that, but here in the United States, internet service providers are legally allowed to sell that information to advertisers. Pretty scary stuff, right? Luckily, we have ExpressVPN to reroute 100% of your traffic to secure encrypted servers, thus preventing your service providers from seeing your browsing history. And yes, ExpressVPN is extremely easy to use. All you gotta do is fire up the app and click one button and boom, you're protected. But Josh, will it work on my tablet? Yeah, it will, okay? ExpressVPN works on all of your devices, including your cell phone, laptop, and even your smart TV. And the best part is ExpressVPN was voted #1 by top tech reviewers like CNET and The Verge. Look, we all know privacy is important. Me personally, I oftentimes have to look up some pretty weird stuff when I'm doing research for this podcast. But thankfully, my traffic is protected with a VPN. So what are you waiting on? Protect your online privacy today by visiting expressvpn.com/Wild West. That's expressvpn.com/Wild West. And you can get an extra 4 months free. expressvpn.com/Wild West. Now, let's get back to the show. Later on that day, Yancey would send his official report to Missouri's lieutenant governor. Quote, "This morning, about 8 and 1/2 o'clock, I accidentally flushed Jesse James and James Younger near the line of Ray and Clay counties and was forced to fight them. They fired 7 shots at me, and I returned fire. James is wounded, I think badly. I escaped with a shot through my coat. My horse run away with me through the woods, tearing the clothes off of me. I lost my pocketbook and my watch. I start immediately in pursuit with a posse, and I think they cannot escape. James is wounded too badly to escape, and his companion will not leave him." End of quote. Now, obviously, Jesse wasn't quite as injured as Yancey thought, and he would indeed continue to elude capture. Matter of fact, I'm not entirely sure that Jesse was wounded at all. This is just another one of those things I had a very difficult time finding information on. There's just not a lot written about it. That said, I did reach out to historian Mark Lee Gardner. Mr. Gardner, if you're not familiar, is the author of Shot All to Hell, Jesse James, The Northfield Raid, and the Wild West's Greatest Escape. And if I'm not mistaken, he's currently working on a new Jesse James biography as we speak. I asked him about Yancey and if he knew anything regarding Jesse's wounds, and Mr. Gardner is of the opinion that Yancey did not shoot Jesse James. So there you go. If you happen to have additional information, please hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com. Now, I have already spoken extensively about Jesse's newspaper buddy, John Newman Edwards, how he was extolling him in the pages of the Kansas City Times and the St. Louis Dispatch. But it wasn't just Newman. Pretty much every other paper there in Missouri with a pro-Confederate bias was doing the same thing. And following that robbery outside of Lexington, they went absolutely wild. The editor of the totally not racist Lexington Caucasian even went so far as to call Jesse out by name. He compared he and his gang to medieval knights and said that their victims should feel honored. Quote, "Lexington has just had the honor of one of their Robin Hood-like visits. The whole proceeding was conducted in the coolest and most gentlemanly manner possible." Now, in the past, these so-called journalists were very careful in the way they covered Jesse. They would claim his innocence with a wink and a nod, while at the same time praising his daring robberies. They even helped establish alibis, reporting that Jesse was living in Montana, and later on, after the wedding, Old Mexico. But with that latest article from the Caucasian and the other papers, these alibis were shattered, to the point that even Jesse's mother, Zerelda, had to do a little damage control. She personally wrote to Miss Hattie Hamlet over in Lexington and forced her to make a retraction. Matter of fact, several of the passengers of that latest stagecoach holdup ended up retracting their statements. And if that ain't enough, Zerelda even paid a visit in person to Lexington and sat down with the editor of the Caucasian. She spoke glowingly of her sons, as I'm sure any mother would, and repeated claims of their innocence. Joining her was the former guerrilla Poole, who assured the editor that Jesse and his new bride were still residing in Mexico. Not everyone was buying it, though. To quote historian T.J. Stiles, it had been a good year so far for Jesse James. Just 27 years old, he had achieved a national reputation. He had carried out 2 high-profile robberies, defeated the Pinkertons and the state authorities, outlasted another sheriff, and married his sweetheart cousin. The hard work that he and Edwards had put in over the last 2 years to transform the bandit crew into Confederate heroes had paid off handsomely, as secessionist newspapers rushed to apologize for and even glorify them in their political campaigns. And everything that he loathed, Reconstruction, the Republican Party, even the Democrats' Union faction, showed signs of crumbling. He may have felt invulnerable, but in the countryside surrounding his mother's farm, his enemies were gathering, preparing to strike back. No one he had harassed, bullied, or fought in the decades since he first took to the brush had forgotten him. Not his Unionist neighbors, not the former militia commanders, and definitely not Alan Pinkerton. End quote. Now, we will circle back to the Pinkertons here in just a moment, including their disastrous raid on the James farm, but there are a few more things I think we should discuss just to put everything into proper context. For instance, In early December, Jesse and the boys headed west and held up a train at Muncie, Kansas. And this was basically just a repeat of the Gads Hill robbery. There weren't nothing there at Muncie but a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of houses. And just like they had done back in January, they rounded up the populace and made them wait on the platform for the train's arrival. The express messenger would later state that when he was confronted by the outlaws, he, quote, readily obeyed, and at their order handed out the contents. One of them took a mail bag, and as I handed out the packages, the other threw them into the bag. I took out $18,000 in currency, $5,000 in gold, and all of the packages of money in the safe. They said they did not want a silver brick that was there, and also gave me back my watch, saying that they did not want my personal property. So yeah, this was a huge score. They ended up getting away with somewhere around $30,000, well over 10 times the amount of money they had gotten in the other train robberies. And back in those days, 30 grand was a hell of a lot of money. As a result, the governor of Kansas placed $2,500 on Jesse's head. The Kansas Pacific Railroad added an additional $5 grand, as did the Wells Fargo Express. Now, just to put this money into perspective, several years later when Billy the Kid was a wanted man, he never had more than a $500 bounty on him. That just goes to show just how famous Jesse James was, and how much of a thorn in the side he was to the powers that be. The newly elected governor of Missouri, Charles Hardin, appealed to the public in his inaugural address, saying that the character of our state and people has been most violently assailed as being wanting in sentiment and efficiency for the maintenance of law and order. I have absolutely no idea what the hell that means, but Hardin followed that up by saying that if Missouri wanted to repair its reputation, then the community needed to be in active support of the law. In other words, stop aiding and abetting these damn criminals. Meanwhile, Edwards and the other pro-Confederate papers continued to defend Jesse. The St. Louis Dispatch printed an editorial claiming that he, his brother Frank, and the Youngers were all but powerless to defend themselves against a, quote, incessant tirade of abuse, and that they were driven to the brush to avoid the cowardly punishment of a crazed and clamorous mob. At the same time, the Lexington Caucasian asserted that their spoils were, quote, just as honestly earned as the riches of many a highly distinguished political leader or railroad job manipulator, end of quote. And I actually kind of agree with that last assessment. To be honest, the only real difference between Jesse James and your average politician is that Jesse stole his money with a gun as opposed to using a lawyer with a briefcase. Now, as good as things were going for Jesse, he and the gang would experience a slight hiccup in early 1875. One of the men who helped him rob that train at Muncie, a guy by the name of Bud McDaniel, got himself arrested. And then just a few months later, in late June, Bud was shot dead by a farmer after escaping jail. As far as I know, though, he did keep his mouth shut, and he never rolled on Jesse and the others. Meanwhile, as I alluded to earlier, Jesse's detractors were quickly and quietly closing in. Remember, Alan Pinkerton was still angry about his men getting killed. And whenever the express companies decided to give up the chase, Pinkerton put up $10,000 of his own money to continue the fight. He also started working a few of Jesse's hometown enemies, one of whom was an attorney by the name of Samuel Hardwick. Described as a quiet and studious man, Hardwick was also an ardent supporter of the Union during the Civil War. And per James' biographer Ted Yeatman, Hardwick soon began acting as somewhat of a point man there in Clay County for Alan Pinkerton, even going so far as to recruit another local named Daniel Askew. Much like Hardwick, Daniel was a resident of Clay County. Matter of fact, his property was directly adjacent to the James farm. That being the case, Askew's homestead was used as a staging ground for what was to come. And joining him there on his property was a Pinkerton detective named Jack Ladd, posing as one of Daniel's hired hands. Rounding off the opposition was the Kearney postmaster, Anthony Harsel. A former member of the enrolled Missouri militia, Harsel's home had been burned by guerrillas during the war, and I guess he still held a grudge. According to Alan Pinkerton, Harsel was just helping to keep an eye on the James boys. Whether or not he used his position as postmaster to open mail addressed to the James family remains unclear, but I do think it's likely. With Clay County sufficiently infiltrated, now all they had to do was sit back and wait. And just as soon as Pinkerton's spies reported seeing Jesse and Frank at their mama's farm, that's when they put their plan into action. Now, Pinkerton had already sent one of his men to the arsenal at Rock Island, Illinois, where he procured a shipment of weapons along with a quote-unquote special device. And like I said, just as soon as they got word that Jesse and his brother were at Zerelda's farm, that's when Pinkerton sent a special train carrying around 8 or 9 of his operatives. Their primary objective, of course, was to either kill or arrest Jesse James. But per Alan Pinkerton's orders, they were also to destroy his mother's house. Quote, "Above all else, destroy the house. Wipe it from the face of the earth." End of quote. And yeah, around 7:30 on the night of January 25th, 1875, the detectives offloaded their gear a couple of miles outside of Kearney, right there on the property of Daniel Askew. There was a guide waiting with horses, and after a late dinner, they began traveling through the forest to the James farm. It was about midnight when they arrived, and they immediately began working to set the place on fire. Apparently, they were using hollowed-out tubes, sort of shaped like Roman candles, and filled with some sort of combustible material. These they used on the home's exterior. And when that didn't work, they took one of those special devices and tossed it through a window. Now, as far as I'm aware, nobody knows exactly what this device was. Alan Pinkerton simply called it a ball of fire. One of the James family servants, Ambrose, actually witnessed it being thrown through the window, and he described it as looking like a, quote, ball or something that was red. And Jesse's mother, Zerelda, said it looked like a bowl of fire. Per historian Mark Lee Gardner, it was an evil-looking metal sphere, 7.5 inches in diameter, filled with a highly flammable liquid that, once lit, was designed to both illuminate and start a deadly conflagration. How do you pronounce that word? Conflagration. I don't know. It was meant to illuminate and start a goddamn fire. That's what it was supposed to do. Now, this is purely speculation on my part, but if I had to guess, I'd say that the accelerant that was being used in that mysterious ball of fire device was the same material also used in those tubes. And according to historian Ted Yeatman, that material being used in the tubes was most likely a little something known as Greek fire. Indeed, Pinkerton himself, in a letter written just a couple of days later, admitted that the operatives there at the farm were well supplied with Greek fire. Now, this is some pretty wild stuff. I had never heard of Greek fire before, but believe it or not, it goes all the way back to the Byzantine Empire and the siege of Constantinople. If you've ever seen Game of Thrones, if you remember the Battle of the Blackwater where they used wildfire, well, the real-life Greek fire pretty much worked in the same way. It was extremely flammable, sort of like an ancient version of napalm, and it absolutely devastated their enemies. Hell, it supposedly even kept burning underwater. And the craziest part is, nowadays, nobody knows how to make it. That said, there was a more modern version of Greek fire patented in 1863 by a guy named Levi Short. I don't know the exact ingredients. I'm pretty sure it was just a mix of kerosene and turpentine. But this was almost certainly what they were using in both those tubes and that cast iron ball of fire they tossed in through the window. And just as soon as it landed inside is when all hell broke loose. Jesse's stepfather Reuben ran out and began ripping the smoldering siding off the exterior of the house. And when he came back in just moments later, he saw Zerelda trying to kick that flaming ball, so he just scooped it up with a shovel, tossed it in the fireplace. Now, it's generally believed that this was not meant to act as a bomb, but nevertheless, the fire that was already burning in the hearth caused it to overheat and explode. A small piece of shrapnel struck Reuben on the side of his head. Another tore through Zerelda's right arm just above the wrist, and yet another struck their son Archie on his left side, burning a hole through his innards. Archie, by the way, was just 8 years old. Meanwhile, as all this was going on, the brave Pinkertons decided to call it quits. By the time Reuben staggered outside and began screaming for help, they had already hauled ass. Doctors were fetched. All total, I think 4 of them ended up visiting the farm that night. And sadly, there just wasn't anything they could do for little Archie. According to Zerelda, quote, "After a while, the doctor came in and told me that he couldn't live much longer. I said to him, 'Oh God, receive the soul of my child.' Archie heard me and replied, 'Tell Mama I'm better.'" These were the last words he spoke. I had often thought of what might happen to Jesse and Frank and was prepared to hear most anything. But I never expected to see this. I never thought I should live to see my pet child stricken down at my side. I used to be a woman of fortitude and resolution. It is all gone now. I could stand anything but this. Man, it's the kids that are supposed to bury their mamas and daddies, not the other way around. Jesse and Frank may have been outlaws, but I wouldn't wish what happened to Zerelda on my worst enemy. Now, despite what you just heard, Zerelda did indeed have quite a bit of pluck left. Later on the next day, her arm was amputated with zero anesthetic. The doctor who performed the procedure said that he didn't think he ever saw a human in all of his life who had as much nerve as Zerelda. Hell, she still had enough presence of mind later on that day to give a thorough account of the attack to a coroner's inquest. A large posse was soon sent out to look for the Pinkertons, but they returned empty-handed. The detectives were last seen in the town of Brookfield, and from there they departed for Illinois. As far as I know, none of them were ever held to account for the death of Archie, at least not by the law. Alan Pinkerton and a few of the others were indicted, but so far as I know, nothing ever really came of it. Once again, if you have additional information, please hit me up at josh@wildwestextra.com. By the way, you may be wondering where Jesse and Frank were on the night of the attack. Well, according to historian TJ Stiles, they had actually been right there at Zerelda's farm earlier that evening, along with their good buddy Clell Miller. They stayed long enough to eat supper and then slipped away once it got dark. That just left Zerelda, her husband Reuben, and the kids, along with the 3 servants, 54-year-old Charlotte, 18-year-old Ambrose, and Perry, who at the time was just 6 years old. Interesting little side note about Perry, but he was mixed race, what they called back in those days a mulatto. And it is widely believed that his father was one of the men there on the Samuel/James farm. Possibly Reuben, but considering that Perry was born in 1868, it very well could have been Frank or even Jesse. Now, earlier we discussed how a few of the locals there in Clay County had helped the Pinkertons prepare for that failed attack. One of them, Samuel Hardwick, the attorney, ended up fleeing the state entirely. If I'm not mistaken, the postmaster Harsel did the same. But the James neighbor, Daniel Askew, well, he decided to stay put. Remember, he's the one who allowed the Pinkertons to use his property to stage the attack. And it's there on his property on the evening of April 12th where Jesse James finally caught up with him. According to Askew's wife, he had gone outside to draw some water from the well. As he was headed back, a mystery man, or possibly 2 mystery men, stepped from the shadows. They spoke in hushed tones for several minutes before one of the strangers pulled out a gun and put 3 bullets in Daniel's head. Minutes later, the assassins stopped at the neighboring farm and stated, "We have killed Dan Askew tonight, and if anyone wishes to know who did it, say the detectives did it. Tell his friends to go and bury the damn son of a bitch tomorrow." End quote. Once again, we don't know for certain that Jesse James was the killer, but this was a pretty common practice during his days as a guerrilla. He and his fellow bushwhackers would occasionally murder somebody and then go to the nearest neighbor's house and brag about what they had done. And on this night in question, Jesse was spotted nearby. I suppose it could have been a coincidence. After all, his mother lived right next door, but he certainly did have the motive. Hell, later on, he would even spend several months in Chicago, allegedly, with plans of personally killing Alan Pinkerton. So I doubt he would have balked at shooting Askew. And for what it's worth, the grandson of one of Jesse's half-sisters would later state that, per family lore, the killers were Jesse and Frank James. And yeah, as far as Jesse was concerned, there were still plenty of others who also needed killing. You know, like that lawyer I mentioned earlier, Samuel Hardwick. He may have fled all the way to St. Paul, Minnesota, hoping to escape Jesse's wrath, but little did he know that a special visit was in the works. And that's what we'll be discussing next week, along with the Northville, Minnesota bank robbery. Maybe. I am still way behind on schedule, so if you don't see a new episode next Wednesday, don't despair. It'll be the following week. But that's the worst case scenario. Hopefully, I will be coming at you very soon with the Northfield story, sooner rather than later. Thank you so much for listening. Do me a favor, if you like what you hear, share this episode with friends and enemies alike. And if you're looking for more true tales from the Wild and Woolly West, head on over to wildwestextra.com. While you're there, go ahead and hit that contact button. Let me know what's on your mind. Or just email me directly at josh@wildwestextra.com. Links down below. Big thank you to authors TJ Stiles, Mark Lee Gardner, and Ted Yeatman. Their research on Jesse James has proven extremely invaluable. I've also provided links down below to their books. Mr. Stiles and Mr. Gardner have been especially helpful and patient in fielding my many emails and annoying questions. So if you're listening, thank you. By the way, just one more thing and I'll let you go, but if you're enjoying today's content, there is another show I think you might want to check out. It's called Riding the West, and it's based on the writing of Rick Steber, a guy who's managed to thus far sell over 2 million books and even win awards from the Western Writers of America. Each episode is about 10 minutes long, and it features stories and poems written by Rick. Riding the West has been downloaded worldwide and is even being used in schools to teach kids about the American West. And I do think that you too will enjoy it. This is not a paid ad, okay? Mr. Steber reached out. I gave his show a listen, and yeah, I thought it would be worthwhile to pass on to you. That's Writing, WRITING, The West. Check it out on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to podcasts. All right, till next time, try not to burn anyone's house down, okay? Don't hit yourself in the head with a door or go robbing any trains or banks. And please, if you're going to utilize some ancient form of hellfire, try not to kill any kids while doing so, okay? Till next time, adios.